I do want to let you know about a few things as we're going to get started with this second session, because we really want to make sure that you are getting not just a great experience here tonight, learning some awesome things from J Warner Wallace, but that you also know that there are some next steps that you can take in order to continue your education in Christian apologetics. There's a few things I want to point your attention to. First of all, right here at Stones Crossing Church, we are actually right about to begin our life group season for the spring, okay? And life groups here at Stones Crossing, they run in 2 semesters, one semester in the spring and one in the fall. And this semester, I'm really excited to be able to present to you a life group that is going to be dealing specifically with Christian apologetics. This is what I'm calling basic apologetics. It's a 10-week overview of many of the different categories in apologetics, and we're going to be talking about that in one of these life groups. I'm really excited to present this, and so right now it's scheduled to be on Monday nights starting February 9th from 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. If you're interested, you can go to stonescrossing.com/lifegroups and you can register for that life group if you'd like to. Right now it's currently at my house, so if all of you guys sign up, we'll probably start meeting here. But we'll let you know after we get the signups going. Another thing I want to let you know about is that next weekend, there is actually another Christian apologetics conference in town. Did you guys know that? Do you guys know about this? It's pretty cool. I just found out about this recently. By the way, this is my friend Francisco right over here. Say hi. This is him. He actually doesn't go to Stones Crossing, and he emailed me. He's like, hey, can we come to this event? I'm like, yeah, absolutely. And he told me that next weekend, and where is this again? It's at Purdue. Okay. This is a symposium on the origins, follow the evidence where it leads. It's going to be next weekend, Friday and Saturday. It's going to feature 2 apologists, specifically Dr. Hugh Ross, if you've heard of him, and also Dr. Fazali Rana, and they're going to be doing some breakout sessions as well. So if you're interested in continuing this discussion, talking about origins, check that out next weekend. One more thing I want to let you know about, another next step that you can take. Up on the screen, we're going to put up a couple different websites and applications for your mobile devices. These are some ways that you can continue your apologetics education on your own. We highly recommend, these are probably like my top 5 when it comes to Christian apologetics. You've got obviously J Warner Wallace's Cold Case Christianity. You can check that out. Stand to Reason is a fantastic one. Greg Kokel is a great guy, and he's got a whole, really over 30 years of experience doing a radio show and all sorts of materials on their website. Cross-examined by Frank Turek. Please convince me. It's actually really funny. If you go to pleaseconvinceme.com right now, it is absolutely plastered with Cold Case Christianity stuff. So go check that out. And then Reasonable Faith, that's William Lane Craig. So check out those. Those are some great resources that can help you to continue in your apologetics education. So we're going to go ahead and continue on with our second session with Mr. Jim Wallace. So would you please give him a big hand as he comes up for round 2.
Worked you pretty hard, I think, in that first session. Would you agree? I mean, we covered some heavy stuff. So now let's take it easy a little bit, okay? And let's take a look at things you're already familiar with, but you may not have even really thought about how to answer those objections I offered at the end of the last session. And I want to walk you through the process that I went through to discover whether or not Christianity was true. This is exactly the process I took. Yes, I'm that crazy methodical about this kind of stuff. I just needed to know. But I want to start with an objection. You want to hear it right from the horse's mouth. Here's what Richard Dawkins says about folks like you and what you crazy Christians believe. I don't think he thinks much of us, to be honest. Many of us saw religion as harmless nonsense. Beliefs might lack all supporting evidence, but we thought, hey, if people needed a crutch for consolation, where's the harm? But September 11th changed all that. You fundamentalists who are willing to say you believe something so deeply that you're willing to fly planes into buildings, that's the problem with the world. And you believe this stuff even though you can't even defend it. You believe this stuff, you haven't even examined it yet. You believe stuff for which you have no supporting evidence. Please don't run for office, okay? Because if you run for political office, you're going to get us into wars without any supporting evidence. You're going to make decisions about public policy without any supporting evidence. Christians who do not come to their beliefs through an evidential path are dangerous. Because they take that view. If you took that approach to everything, how would you know what car to buy? I mean, you spend more time researching the car you're going to buy than researching your worldview. That's the argument of the atheist community. I had that argument. I was absolutely in this camp. It wasn't just that I thought this was a benign, harmless thing. I thought this was a dangerous thing because this is unsupported belief, and unsupported belief leads you in all kinds of crazy places. So the question I really have is this statement true? Do we really have no supporting evidence for our Christian beliefs? Do you think that someone like Richard Dawkins even knows what the broad categories of evidence are? I think he would say, you Christians, you might have some arguments. That argument you just had from design in biological organisms, oh, that's great. But that's not really evidence. Your cosmological argument, your teleological argument, your axiological argument, your ontological argument, those aren't really evidences. You don't have any forensic evidence. You don't have any direct evidence. None of that stuff. Really? Do you think that I make cases with just this stuff? Do you think I've ever had any of this stuff in my cases? No. As a matter of fact, I wish I did. But I don't. I don't think Richard knows the broad categories. I want to teach them to you so you know what they are, and then we're going to take a look, because this whole discussion really is about what would qualify as evidence to begin with. And do we have any of that as Christians to support our Christian beliefs? That's what this is all about. And we got to ask this question. It comes down to knowing what the categories of evidence are. And I'm here to tell you there are only two broad categories of evidence. There's direct evidence and indirect evidence. That's it. Everything falls into those two categories. Indirect evidence is also sometimes called circumstantial evidence. And I bet when I say that, most of you think, oh, that's not good. Circumstantial evidence isn't good. I mean, a circumstantial case, that's junk. Really? That's what I want to dispel today. That is not just junk. That's every case I've ever had. All my cases are entirely circumstantial. We've never lost. Because circumstantial evidence is compelling, especially when you know how to assemble it. So I want to teach you that in this session. Remember I said to you in the first morning session how there are some similarities between working cold cases and examining Christianity? It's because cold cases are events that happened in the distant past, 30 years ago. And I don't typically have any eyewitnesses in these cases that can tell me, I saw who did it. If I had somebody like that in my case, it would have been solved 30 years ago. It wouldn't be a cold case, it'd be a solved case. So I don't have any eyewitnesses in my cases. I also don't have any good forensic evidence. I tried. When I first started this detail 15 years ago, I opened up 30 cases and looked at them, hoping for a quick DNA hit. Some easy way to solve a case to show my sergeant that we could actually do these. So you should fund this detail. 2 guys full time. And I couldn't find any. We just don't happen to have any that are solved with DNA or a fingerprint or something like that. That's aren't the nature of my cases. So this is the nature of my cases. They're the old-fashioned kind of cases. You build them by doing lots of interviews, lots of old-fashioned detective work, and you assemble a circumstantial case. That's how we make these cases. That's the nature of all my cold cases. And if you think about it, that's very similar to examining the Christian worldview. Right? Because the Christian worldview is an event in the distant past, no living eyewitnesses, no forensic evidence. We build that case differently. I'm going to show you how we build it. So I'm going to teach you some principles of evidence in this section, okay? The first principle of evidence you need to know is the difference between what's reasonable and what's possible. Remember how in the last session we talked about we don't care about what's possible isn't as important as what's reasonable. As a matter of fact, the problem with possible is that anything is possible. Really, think about it. Anything is possible. Why do you think we had you go out of this room at the break? If you were here for the morning services, did you notice in the morning services these tables weren't here? This room looked different. That's not an accident. You left, and while you were gone in those 4 hours, we parked the mothership right where the church used to be. That's right. And you walked in the door, you thought of the front door of the church. No, 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 no. We cleverly disguised it. You walked right into the mothership. And as soon as you got through that front door, we sprayed you with that coma-inducing alien spray. And you've been in a coma for the last, 4 hours? Thinking you were actually in, 4 hours. It felt like 4 hours, 2 hours. And you thought you were actually in the church, but you aren't in church. Tomorrow morning, you're going to wake up, and you thought you were here today, but you're not even here. You're in the mothership. And tomorrow when you wake up, this will all have been a very elaborate coma dream. Now, let me ask you a question. Right now, while you're in the alien-induced coma, how could you prove this isn't true? Isn't this at least possible? Isn't it possible that you're imagining this? I think you'd have to say it's at least possible. But you would say it's not reasonable. That's the point. In criminal trials, we tell jurors they're not to consider possible. They're only to consider what's reasonable in light of the evidence offered. So let me give you an example. A case from 1988, this guy kills his wife for about $40,000 he did not want to give her. He had $800,000 in his retirement fund. They were divorcing. She just wanted 40 grand. He said, nope, not going to give it to you. So she talked her attorney into writing it into their sale of their house. So they sold their house, and the attorney wrote it in that she would get $40,000 more than him right off the top. And the judge actually signed it. And they sold that. They signed the order on a Wednesday. He found out on Thursday, and he shot her in the head on Friday morning. Wasn't going to have any of that. You're not getting that money. He shot her in the head while she was packing the house that they were selling in the living room of their house. Ran out the back, ran to the pier, got rid of the gun. Afterwards, at the trial, the defense attorney said, well, wait a minute. How do we know this isn't, to the jury, how do we know this isn't a burglary that went bad? How do we know this isn't a burglar who walks in thinking the house is empty, discovers there's a woman in the house packing the house, panics, and shoots her? Time out. Have they presented any evidence of a burglary, like forced entry? No. Have they presented any evidence anything was taken in a burglary? No. Have they presented any evidence anyone's been in the house other than the husband and the wife? No. Have they presented any evidence of a rash of burglaries in the neighborhood back then? No. Then you're not allowed to speculate, that's what it's called, about the possibilities that aren't supported by evidence in your jury deliberations, because possible doesn't count. It's not beyond a possible doubt. That's not the judicial standard, right? We have a standard of proof, and it's not beyond a possible doubt because you'd never convict anyone. It's beyond a reasonable doubt. So we have to have the first distinction. Possible doesn't matter. Only reasonable matters. Reasonable in light of the evidence. Something to think about. Also, I want to teach you about circumstantial evidence. Let's put together a circumstantial case and show you the difference between direct evidence and circumstantial evidence. Let's say we're going to convict this guy right here. He's been charged with killing his girlfriend. He bludgeoned her to death with this baseball bat. Now, I'm going to make the case directly, first of all, make it easy. I need to see a witness. Is there a witness who actually, well, heck, he was there. We could ask him. What happened? Do you think if I asked this guy what happened, I could trust anything he tells me? I don't think so. Especially if he's been lying about it for 30 years, right? He's gotten good at this. Can't trust him. So I need a different way to make the case. What if I, instead of having him as a witness, I had a witness who actually was across the street and saw the whole thing? That would be different. Now I've got a direct piece of evidence that all, by the way, direct evidence is in one form: eyewitness testimony. If I want to make a case directly, I need an eyewitness. In the two categories of evidence, direct and indirect, witness testimony is on the direct side. Juries are instructed this way by judges. If this is an instruction in California. If somebody comes inside and tells you it's raining outside, on the basis of that direct eyewitness testimony, you can infer that it's raining outside. On the other hand, if somebody comes inside and they've got a raincoat on, they take it off, it's dripping wet, and they close their umbrella, and they stick it in the umbrella rack, from that indirect evidence, you can infer it's raining outside. Oh, but wait a minute. I mean, how do we know it's really raining? Maybe they just walked through a sprinkler that was, going a little bit too hard and got them all wet. Really? So they wore a rain jacket and carried an umbrella in case they encountered a sprinkler? Okay, it's possible, but it's not reasonable. That's the difference here. So we're going to make this case first with direct. What if she said, okay, I saw the whole thing. I saw him do it. As a matter of fact, I know this guy. My neighbor across the street, she's a very delightful lady, and she always fights with her boyfriend. I know the boyfriend. And sure enough, yesterday I was cutting my roses, and I'm trimming my roses, and I hear them arguing across the street. I look up, and I see through their big plate glass window that they're arguing again, and before I know it, he swings on her. And he punches her in the head twice. She goes down, he gets a baseball bat, he's just pounding on her. Then he runs out to his car, and he drives off. Wow. How do you know who this is? Well, I've known her and him since they were this tall. We all grew up in this neighborhood. We're like a tight-knit family. We do all of the holidays together, block parties, 4th of July. Heck, he was wearing the shirt that I gave him for Christmas 2 years ago. Now, if you saw that, if you had that testimony and she held up under cross-examination, you could make this entire case on one piece of direct evidence, her. That's a direct case. But let's change the scenario slightly. What if he's wearing a mask on his head? He's not as easy to identify as this. What if she can say, well, he's about the right size and build, but I can't tell you for sure if it was the boyfriend because he had a mask on his face. Would that change things? Yeah, now we can't make it this way. We have to make it a different way. We can't make it directly. Let's go knock on this guy's door. Hey, dude, what were you doing yesterday about the time of this murder? I was out drinking with buddies. What are their names? We go interview those guys. Those guys say, you know what, I haven't seen this guy in 6 weeks. I don't know what he's talking about, but we were not drinking together yesterday. So he's lying about his alibi, and he fits the general description. How many of you right now think he's guilty? Raise your hand. Oh, really? Wow. You guys need to move to California because you'd be great jurors in Los Angeles County. That's pretty harsh, don't you think, to convict the poor guy because he's got a bad alibi? I one time had a guy who was lying about his alibi because he was cheating on his wife on the day of the murder, but he wasn't involved in my murder. But he was lying about something else he didn't want to be caught for. So that needs to be a little more than this. But when you go to his house and do a search warrant, he happens to have a murder weapon. He's got a baseball bat in his closet. No one here's got a baseball bat in their closet, do you? Sure you do. By the way, in Canada, when I do this talk in Vancouver, I do a lot of talks in the Vancouver area, there's no baseball team on that side of Canada. So these people always tell me, after I did this for about a week, the same talk. Finally, somebody in the 5th talk said to me, you know, Jim, here in Vancouver, nobody plays baseball. We hate baseball over here. And so if you had a baseball bat in your closet, you would be suspicious here in Vancouver. And I thought, really? So in my Vancouver talks, I've changed the Photoshop. He's carrying a hockey stick. But for today, he's carrying a baseball bat. Only his baseball bat in his house is very unusual. And the fat part of the bat, it's all nicked up and dinged up and chipped up like he's been using it as a club, not as a baseball bat. He's not hitting baseballs or softballs with that thing. So I do a little forensic test on it, and sure enough, there's no biological fluids of any kind, blood or otherwise, on this bat. Why? Because he's soaked it in bleach. How many of you soak your baseball bat in bleach? Other killers in the room, 2 of them. So you see the problem? Now I've got a bleached baseball bat, a BO alibi fits the general description. Not only that, in the search warrant, he's got a pair of pants, Levi's. Well, everyone's got Levi's, but his Levi's are different. When you luminol, that's a chemical we use. Under certain lighting conditions, they will luminesce if certain fluids are present. Any kind of body fluid, blood, but also certain cleaning detergents will also luminesce. His pants luminesce at the knees. Something is there that's glowing, but they're KM negative, no blood. It's not blood. It's not body fluids. Looks like it's detergent. He's using some kind of detergent to spot clean his pants, but the pants are filled with mud and dirt everywhere. They're just dirty pants, except at the knees where they're spot cleaned. What's he trying to get off those knees? If it's dirt or mud, why isn't he cleaning the entire set of pants? What is different about the knees he feels compelled to clean? BO alibi, bleached bat, spot clean pants. Not only that, there's no sign of forced entry in the house. Whoever got in this house to do this murder did not have to kick a door or break a window to get in. There are only a few people who have access to the house with a key. The victim had a key. The victim's mother, who died 2 months ago, she also had a key. And the victim's crazy boyfriend, who you're talking to, also had a key. He explains he's a 1 in 3 relationship to that key. I'm feeling pretty good about this guy right now. But not only that, he'll tell you he's a crazy boyfriend. When you interview him, he talks about how their relationship is very tumultuous, up and down. Yes, he feels bad, but he does smack her once in a while. He loses his temper. He doesn't mean anything by it. He'll smack her and apologize afterwards. He loves her. It's just his nature. He's a little bit hot-tempered, and she always takes him back. She always forgives him. It's just the nature of their relationship. It's a violent relationship. And yes, on the day of the murder, she did tell him that she was cheating on him. Can you imagine why anyone would cheat on this guy? Bring this guy home to mom. Hey, is my next? No, I don't think so. And he says, yeah, I lost my temper. And in front of her friends, I did threaten to kill her, and I smacked her pretty good. But I didn't kill her. So now you have how many of you guys feel pretty good about him now? Raise your hand. It's okay, get it up high so I can see it. See, we're building this case. Not only that, when the witness says that when he ran out the door, the suspect was wearing a very unusual pair of boots. It's a pair of boots that has leather on the side that's more vertical. And you do a little research on this. There's only one manufacturer of a boot like that. They only sell them in one store in the county. They've only sold like 30 pairs in the last 2 years. And who do you think's got one of those 30 pairs in his house? Your guy. So now you see what's happening here. We've got a 30-to-1 relationship and a 3-to-1 relationship. What are the odds that one of the 3 is also one of the 30? Do you see the problem here? Is triangulating bad for this guy. If you'd have got to the house just a little bit later, he'd have been dead because he was in the middle of writing a note, which is still on the counter. And in that note, he says he's about to commit suicide because yesterday he did something so horrific he cannot forgive himself. He can't take it back. He lost his temper. He wished he hadn't done it, but he did do it, and now he can't forgive himself for doing it, so he has no choice but to take his life. If you'd arrived there just 15 minutes later, he'd have already been dead. But he doesn't say in his suicide note that he killed his girlfriend. So now you have some pre-behavior, some post-behavior. None of this is direct evidence. Not only that, the witness says when he got in the car and drove off, it was an unusual car. She knew because of her friends used to have this car in college. What was it? It's like a canary color, like a yellow 1972 Volkswagen Karmann Ghia. Do you guys even know what a Volkswagen? Do you guys know what a Volkswagen Karmann Ghia is? Didn't think so. Of course, you guys know. Revealing the age of the room. Sorry. But young people don't know. As a matter of fact, in California, these kinds of cars can survive pretty well. But I doubt in Indiana a car like that would survive for very long if it's not garaged. So you do a little DMV search and you discover there's only 2 Volkswagen Karmann Ghias that are even registered anywhere in the county. Don't know what color they are because the DMV doesn't tell you that. But when you do the search warrant and you pull open his garage door, what do you think he's got in his garage? That, by the way, is a Karmann Ghia. There it is. This is the kind of case we build in front of juries. I think most of us in this room know that, it's still possible he's innocent. Would you agree? It's possible he is just really unlucky. Seriously. On the day he lost his temper and found out that his girlfriend was cheating on her and he threatened to kill her, and the day before he was thinking about committing suicide for something horrific he did, some other person came in and killed her. Bummer, huh? What a bummer of bad luck. And defense attorneys will do this very, very well. They'll say, I can explain this some other way, and I can explain this some other way, and I can explain this some other way. And 8 unfortunate coincidences make my guy look guilty. Okay, that's possible, but that's not reasonable. Because it turns out there's one causal factor that can unify all the evidence and explain all of it completely, and that is that our guy did it. He's the one causal factor that could unify the evidence. And I wouldn't do this case with 8 pieces in front of a jury. I'd do it with 80 pieces in front of a jury. I call it death by 1,000 paper cuts. Right? Any one of these paper cuts doesn't matter, but too many, you just can't survive them. And that's how we do these kinds of cases. They're cumulative, circumstantial cases. The more the pieces, the more reasonable the inference. Believe it or not, there's a reason why I'm telling you this, okay? We're getting to it. This is what is called a circumstantial case. And this is the nature of every one of my cases. And this is how I build them. And judges instruct juries all the time that circumstantial evidence is to be used and treated exactly the same as direct evidence. It's to be given the same value, the same merit. You are not to think of circumstantial evidence as any less meritorious in your deliberations. You're to give it the exact same value. So when you hear someone say that's just a circumstantial case, I want you to slap them in the forehead. Because there's no such thing. Some cases are circumstantial, some cases are not. But one is not less than the other. Got it? Okay. As a matter of fact, there are times when I would prefer a circumstantial case. You know why? Witnesses lie because they want to be on TV with you, because they want to help their uncle who's accused of a murder. Whatever the reason may be, witnesses sometimes lie. So let's go to that for a second. If I'm not working a circumstantial case, I'm working a direct case, and that is what applies to Christianity, because the Gospels are allegedly eyewitness accounts about the life of Jesus. And I've learned one thing: trust no one. Just don't trust anyone. I was telling these guys, if on a pastoral staff or on an elder board, it's always good to have a retired cop, because he's the guy who's going to go, they're lying. That piece of trash is lying. I can tell you right now, I've worked these guys for 15 years. I see it all the time. Don't trust that guy. That guy's good on your elder board, right? Because he's the guy who kind of brings it back to center, all right? So I don't trust anybody. Test your eyewitnesses. And we actually have a process by which we test eyewitnesses. As a matter of fact, in California, there's a jury instruction, I think with 13 questions that jurors are allowed to think about in their mind when evaluating eyewitness testimony on the stand. To make it easy, it breaks down into those 4 categories. To make it even easier, I'll break it down into 4 simple words. If a witness can actually be demonstrated he was really there, and he can be corroborated in some way, he hasn't changed his story over time, and he's not biased against you, you should consider his testimony reliable. This is how we test eyewitnesses in court. Could the Gospels survive this kind of test? I didn't know any other way to test the Gospels as an atheist who was a detective than to test them this way. I knew this is how I would test people who came to me with some kind of crazy story. I would test them in those 4 areas. So I thought, well, okay, if I'm going to believe this crazy story about Jesus, I'm going to have to test him in these 4 areas. So I'm going to test him with you tonight. 3 of the 4 areas, because the one is too much and we're going to get out on time this next session. So here we go. The first one, were they really there? This is my dad, actually, 1974. He's walking this suspect across to the courtroom where he's about to be tried for the murder of a 10-year-old girl in 1972. I think I told you about that a little while ago. She was kidnapped on Thanksgiving Day in 1972. Her parents were making dinner inside. She was kidnapped off the street. We found her body the next day in Oxnard on the coast, on the rocks. This guy confessed to the entire murder. On an aside, my dad hates this picture, which is why I love to use it, because he's still an atheist. I'm going to work this guy. So here he is in this. He thinks it's a terrible picture. I'm a greasy detective, he says. I got a greasy haircut, that mustache he hated. I'm wearing a polyester suit. And look at this, my backside looks really big sticking out right here. That's actually his gun under his belt, right? But he couldn't, who knows, right? So I always use this all the time. Until he starts watching these presentations and catches me, I'm going to continue to use it, okay? He never liked this guy. But these 2 detectives, the lady standing holding his arm and the guy with the sideburn right there, these guys believed everything he said, and he came in and he confessed to every gruesome detail of this murder, everything he did to her, and then how he killed her and what he did with her body. It's a 1,000-page transcript. I've read it. It's horrific, and none of it is true. He wasn't even there. He's got some issues, but he's not a killer. We actually excluded him from the case on the eve of the trial with blood evidence. Primitive blood evidence back in 1974, but nonetheless, we were now, 17 months behind the crime? Still unsolved. You can't go 17 months behind a crime like this and have much luck. So I've got the DNA. It's been submitted to CODIS, but no hit. So don't know who killed Terry Lynn Hollis. I don't know. But it's not this guy. Because you can't be the suspect if you weren't present. But you also can't be the witness if you weren't present. And my suspicion was that these Gospels are written late. Too late to have been written by eyewitnesses. If the Gospels were first written late in history, they cannot be eyewitness accounts. They could be something, but they can't be eyewitness accounts. Here's the events, about 30 to 33. We'll just kind of use those dates for the sake of argument. But here's a church council, the Council of Laodicea. That's not the Nicene Council. This is the first church council that really talks about what is to become the canon of the New Testament. But how do we know when the Gospels are actually written? If the Gospels are written late in history down here, they can't be eyewitness testimony. Guys have been dead for 300 years, okay? There's something else. They're not eyewitness testimony. And by the way, there are people who make this case all the time, like Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman is the head of the Bible department at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He's written a number of books. He studied. He went to Moody, then he went to Wheaton, then he went to Princeton and studied under Bruce Metzger, one of the finest biblical scholars of the 20th century. This is probably the most respected, well-educated, proficient, certainly in terms of writing, biblical scholars on the North American continent. If your son or daughter went to his class, they'd be sitting in front of a guy who studied with the best, but he's not a Christian. And he does not believe Jesus is who he said he was. And he believes there's no way to even know which version of Christianity was really true because there were so many competing ideas. We've lost so many versions of Christianity. We've lost so many scriptures. You have no idea how often the scriptures have been changed over time. There are more variations in the original text than there are words in the New Testament. You can't tell what was really said originally about Jesus. And the titles, the authorship of those New Testament documents is probably not what you think they are anyway. They're all forged. And in his latest book, he's writing about how Jesus became God over time. Started off as a simple preaching rabbi, and then as legend grew, he became the Christ of Christianity. A lot of accusations. But if people like this are right about the late start of these Gospels, we should stop having conferences like this and stop having Sunday morning services, because whatever it is you have in your New Testament, it's not eyewitness testimony. It's something else. So the question I had is that really where it was written? If we could date it over here somewhere, at least it would pass the first test, the test of being present. It doesn't mean it's true. They could be an early lie. But it is harder to lie early and in the region where there are other eyewitnesses who would know the truth. If you're going to lie about this, either lie late when everyone's dead or lie early outside the region where no one can catch your lie. Make sense? So how do we know that these are actually dated early? I'm going to make a case, a circumstantial case for the early dating. And I'm going to send this to you as a Bible insert. So you're going to have the timeline sent to you in color that you can print out and stick in your Bible. Got it? But track with me. You don't need to take notes because I'm going to send it to you. Bible scholars, this is a well-taught church. Don't fail your pastor. Don't embarrass your pastor. Tell me, what is that book of the New Testament in which the history of the area around Jerusalem is recorded? Actually, the whole area around where the apostles preached is recorded. After Jesus ascends to heaven, it's written by a guy named Luke, and it's called the book of Acts. Very good, you passed the first test. In the book of Acts, or any other book in the New Testament, he's like, okay, thank you, passed the first test. That's good. Okay, so in the book of Acts, or any other New Testament book, is the destruction of the temple ever described in Scripture? Now think about that for a second. We know when it occurs around 70 AD according to the Jewish historian Josephus. And we know that this is an important point of history because Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple in the New Testament. So if I'm writing a lie about this whole story, I'm Luke, wouldn't you include the fulfilled prophecy of Jesus? If I want to make it look like Jesus is an accurate predictor, stick that in there. Is it anywhere in the book of Acts? Is it anywhere in Scripture? No. It's missing from. If I asked you to write a history of New York City and you left out the Twin Towers, I'd be going, something's up. This is worse than the Twin Towers. The Roman army came in and barricaded the city, blockaded the city, surrounded the city. They starved it out. They cut off all the water supplies, food supplies, everything. Josephus says by the time the Roman guards actually got in, the siege lasted 2 or 3 years. When the Roman guards finally got in, they found the city was starving so desperately that one Jewish woman was eating her own son. That's what Josephus says. Whatever the case may be, we know one thing for sure. This was a horrific period of time. All of it is missing from the book of Acts. Why? Peter talks about suffering. Wouldn't you mention something about this? Nothing. Not only that, at the end of the book of Acts, what's Paul up to? Is he still alive or dead? End of the book of Acts. He's alive. He's in custody in Rome. Well, we know when Paul died. He died around 67, 64, right in that range. But he's still alive at the end of the book of Acts. Hey, not only that, Peter's still alive at the end of the book of Acts. Not only that, James, the brother of Jesus, is still alive at the end of the book of Acts. Now, Luke has no problem describing deaths in the book of Acts. He describes the death of Stephen, minor player. He describes the death of James, the brother of John, in 44 AD, minor player. The three most important people in the book of Acts are Paul, Peter, and James, the brother of Jesus, who is leading the church in Acts 15. He's the leader of the first church council. Yet you don't mention how they die? Why is all this stuff missing from the book of Acts? That's a lot of important stuff that should be in the book of Acts, and it's not there. What could explain its absence? Yeah, what if it hasn't happened yet? If it hasn't happened yet, Luke can't write about it. I think a reasonable inference, which we will test, is that the book of Acts is written before, and I'll be conservative, we'll place it 1 year before the first missing event. I'll put it at 60. Now let me ask you this, Bible scholars, Sunday school graduates, here we go. Luke wrote 2 books. He wrote the book of Acts. This is not a trick question. The other book he wrote is called the Gospel of Luke. Very good. If you couldn't pass that one, I was really going to give the death stare. But I'll have to do that now. Book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke. So tell me, which was written first? Gospel of Luke was written first. Used to be one of one large papyrus. Now, that means we have to put the dating of Luke slightly before the book of Acts. How do I know that the Gospel of Luke was written first? Now, I'll tell you why I dated it at 53, but how do I know it was written first? Because Luke tells me that in the first chapter of Acts. In my former book, Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and teach, verse 2, until he was taken up to heaven. That former book is the Gospel of Luke. I'm dating it early, 53. Why? Because I think there are clues in the Bible. It's all circumstantial so far, but track with me. Here's Paul's letter to Timothy. To be fair, Bart Ehrman does not believe that this is a Pauline letter. We'll get back to that in a minute. But here he's writing to Timothy, and he says, Timothy, you should take care of your church leaders. They deserve to be supported. And Paul says something really cool. The scripture says, we're about to hear and see what Paul considers to be scripture. And he quotes 2 verses. Do not muzzle the ox while it's treading out the grain. Deuteronomy. Old Testament, who cares? He's always talking about the Old Testament. But what's this verse? The worker deserves his wages. That is not from the Old Testament. That concept is in the Old Testament, but those words are from the Gospel of Luke. Paul is quoting Luke to Timothy as early as 63 and calling it Scripture. How much longer had it existed before that to be accepted by Timothy as Scripture? We now know that at least here, but I said 53. Because there's another book that Paul wrote that Bart Ehrman does not deny is Pauline. He believes it is Pauline. It's much earlier. It's called 1 Corinthians. Paul had visited the Corinthian church in 51 and had taught them about the Lord's Supper. But by 53 or so, they were all just a bunch of knuckleheads. They're out there cheating on their wives. They're sleeping with family members. They're getting drunk before the Lord's Supper. Paul comes back into Corinth and he says, guys, time out. I didn't teach it to you this way. You need to have a different attitude about the Lord's Supper. And he reminds them in 53 of what he taught them in 51. And he says, go back to what I taught you. And every word matters to a detective. When I first read these words, I said, oh, that's interesting, because look what he says. He says, the Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, he said, this is my body, which is given up for you. Do this in remembrance of me. He says it twice. Do this in remembrance of me. There are 4 versions of the Lord's Supper. And none of them say that Jesus said, do this in remembrance of me, except for one. And it's not Matthew, it's not John, it's not Mark. He's again quoting the Gospel of Luke. Don't be surprised, Luke and Paul were buddies. But now he's quoting Luke's Gospel 10 years earlier. And he's telling this group, I taught you this 2 years ago, but go back to it. So how much earlier had this been circulating as a gospel? Interesting. I think this is a good date for Luke's Gospel. Now, every word is important to a detective. Think about it, it is. What'd you do last night, Jim? Oh, I took my beautiful wife, Susie, out for dinner. We've been married for 35 years. We had a great dinner. I told you a lot. What'd you do last night? I could have said it a number of different ways. What'd you do last night? I took my wife to dinner. I left her name out. Didn't call her beautiful. Maybe it means nothing. Look at my entire interview. Maybe I'm that way about everybody. But I did give you a shorter version. Right? What'd you do last night? Took the wife out for dinner. The wife. Not even a possessive pronoun. Not my wife. I took the wife. If I describe everybody else as a my, but I describe her as the, I hope you didn't hurt her. I hope she's still alive, because I'm going to be working you. What'd you do last night? Took the old lady out for dinner. Very different approach. Do you see, every word matters. You have choices in how you describe things. and so does Luke. Let's take a look at Luke's first line in the Gospel of Luke. He's writing again to Theophilus, the same guy he was writing to in the book of Acts. And he says to Theophilus, hey, I'm not an eyewitness in this, big guy, I'm not. I'm just somebody who was an investigator, spoke to all the eyewitnesses. He says, I therefore, since I myself carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. Really? There's an extra word in there that he chose to put in that he doesn't need to put in there. What's the word that doesn't need to be there? Orderly. If you're writing a historical account, do you really need to tell me it's in the right order? Isn't that an assumption? You know, I'm writing history. Throw it on the table. You figure it out. No. It's in the right order. If I choose to tell you I'm writing an orderly history for you, I want to know why you're saying orderly. Well, because in the first century, there was another account out there that wasn't orderly. And Papias tells us about it. He's a bishop, a first century bishop. He says that Mark is scribing the lectures and the sermons of Peter in Rome, and that becomes the Gospel of Mark. But Papias says that Mark is writing an account that is accurate, but not orderly. Wow. So Mark's Gospel is not orderly. Luke says, I've talked to everybody, including Mark. As a matter of fact, the one person that is quoted more than anyone else in Luke's Gospel, guess who? Mark. Only he's got Mark's stuff now in the right order. But that means that Mark's Gospel has to come first. Now look how close we are to the events. Do you see how close we are? I got you there by starting off with the first missing event and working backwards circumstantially, but I confirmed it a couple of times along the way with Scripture. I think this is a reasonable inference. That we have an early account, written early, does not mean it's true. Just means it's written early. It is harder to tell a lie when you write it this early. Because there are people around who could say, hey, I knew Jesus. He was none of those things. Now we can talk about the second section of verification. This is an important, critically important section that we're going to skip because there's no way to do it in a short period of time. I'm going to send it all to you. I'm going to send you the longer version of this talk. Yes, believe it or not, there are actually longer versions of these talks. But I'm going to move instead now to honesty and accuracy over time because these are important things. This is the guy, I think I told you guys about the guy who killed his wife. I think I told you guys at lunch, but he killed his wife in 1981, and he said that she ran off and left him. We didn't work it for 6 years because we had it as missing persons. And her family never complained about her being missing. So we figured if she ran off, she must have come home and they just never called us. So 6 years later, my sergeant's trying to clear paper. He decides to pull these cases out. He calls this family to see if she came home. But guess what? She didn't come home. Never, ever showed up anywhere in 6 years. So my sergeant goes, uh-oh, we should have been working this as a homicide. And we hadn't been. So now we have a homicide and no crime scene. 6 years had gone by. They'd moved. I have no crime scene, not a single piece of physical evidence. We convicted this guy in 4 hours. Lots of unanswered questions. I can't tell you how he killed her, when he killed her, where he killed her, what he did with her car, how he got rid of her body. I couldn't answer those questions for the jury. It didn't matter because this guy had subtly and carefully changed his story over time. He changed his story because he couldn't remember 6 years later. He hadn't told this story for 6 years. And he couldn't return to his mind's eye to get a picture of what had happened because he made that stuff up. And his slowly evolving story gave him away. If you change your story over time, you should not be trusted. And that was my suspicion when it comes to the Gospels. After all, think about it. Have you read your Gospels? We said this last night. Do you know how many variations, how many alleged contradictions there are in your Gospels? Have you ever read the resurrection account? Seriously. You got so many different versions of stories, and they don't line up. Come on. How many angels, I said this last night, I'll repeat it again. How many angels are at the tomb when the women get there? Is it one? Is it two? Depends on the gospel. How many women run to the tomb? 2? 3? Depends on the gospel. What's the sign over Jesus' cross say? 4 accounts, 4 different signs. Come on. They don't line up. They don't match up. How can you accept this stuff? Well, that was one issue that never bugged me as an atheist reading the gospel accounts because, man, I've been working eyewitness accounts for years. And if you have 3 people who see the same crime, trust me, their story is not going to line up. It's going to have all kinds of apparent contradictions. I remember I had a murder that occurred several years ago, and they called me out. I was in the middle of the night. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. I get there, and sure enough, it's raining at the crime scene. I almost always will tell the dispatcher. I give her very important instructions before I leave my house. But this night, I didn't. I just got up, put my clothes on, and went to the crime scene. Because the instructions I always give the dispatcher are, hey, I'm on my way. Do me a favor. Make sure the patrol officer's there. Separate the witnesses for me. Always say that. Always. But sure enough, I forgot. So when I get there and it's raining, I got these witnesses, and the officers are very sweet. They don't want these witnesses to suffer in the rain, waiting for me to get there for an hour. So they put all of them in the back of a patrol unit where they sat for an hour talking to each other before I got there. And you all know that's not good. Because now they've had an hour to get their story together. And they have honestly and sometimes very innocently shaped their story so it matches. They don't want to seem like they want to help me out. So they've kind of lined up their stories. So now I get them out of the car, I have the same story 4 times. I don't want the same story 4 times. I want 4 slightly different stories because it's up to me to figure out why they're slightly different because no one's lying. The crime did occur. They all saw the crime. But the apparent contradictions I can resolve by just interviewing. The problem, of course, is we can't go back and interview the gospel authors. So what we have still are the apparently cloudy, muddy, some kind of apparent great, no problem. When I read that, I thought to myself, these actually feel like they're within the range I would expect from eyewitnesses. So don't get hung up on the fact that you have 2 accounts from any eyewitnesses that don't match. That is always, always, always the case. Always. That's a good thing. Because if you had 4, do you think atheists would be any happier with our gospels if every word for word was identical? No, they would say this is clearly a lie. They've lined them all up. So you can't win one way or the other on this, but trust me, eyewitness accounts have the flavor of what we might think are contradictions, but they're really not. Let's go back to the issue I had with the Gospels. Here was my suspicion. My suspicion was that whatever was written originally, even if it was written early, how do I know how many times it was changed over time before it finally got in my Bible? This thing happens at crime scenes too. You got a crime scene, and then 30 years later, God bless you, you have a courtroom. How do I know? I'll put a piece of evidence at the crime scene. Let's put this casing here. Do you see it? There's a casing I put in the crime scene over here. See it? Now, 30 years later, I'm actually going to go and present this casing to the jury. Here it is in trial. And I'm going to say that we found this casing 30 years ago at the crime scene. And the markings that are on this casing, the extractor pin marking, all of that stuff indicates it belongs to this defendant's gun. This is evidence of his involvement. The problem is going to be, how do I know that some detective didn't hop into the property room 10 years after the fact and etch in those markings on the casing that weren't originally there? He puts it back in property. Nobody knows. The next person that comes along has no idea the evidence has been altered, and they give it to the next person, all of which we're all dumb. We have no idea. This has been altered. I take it into court thinking it's legitimate evidence, and now I have a bad piece of evidence in court that was altered from its original condition. By the way, defense attorneys will make this kind of claim all the time. So I have to address this issue. Couldn't something similar have happened to the New Testament? You get a version of, say, John's gospel. Oh, yeah, right. Now I bring that into the council 300 years later. How do I know how many times somebody in history has either copied it wrong, intentionally or unintentionally, or made slight changes? It could have happened thousands of times. And by the time the next people get it, they have no idea that it's been altered that many times. They bring it into the council thinking it's legitimate evidence. Same problem. Do you see the similarities? This was my suspicion all along. Is you can't trust what we have now because it's not what they had then. How do we test that? Well, in criminal trials, we test it pretty simply. We ask a question. Okay, was there anybody back in 1980 who took a picture of this or wrote a really good report describing the evidence as it was in 1979 or whatever it was? A Polaroid picture, an officer on the scene. Do you guys even know what Polaroids are? Do you guys know what Polaroids are? No, you don't. I can tell you don't. Okay, at least you're honest. Okay. I'll show you what a Polaroid is, just so you know. I brought one today. These are the new Polaroids. They actually still make Polaroid cameras. Did you know that? They look a little bit different. Let me show you what they look like. That's a Polaroid camera. Because you don't know what they are, I'm going to show you what it does. It's pretty cool. You ready? Yeah. So you wait for it to charge. Give me a second. There you go. And then you point it and you click it. There's no like LED. No, you have to actually look through a viewfinder. Crazy. Wait. It's coming. So bright. that is going to develop into an image, right? It's pretty small now. This version's smaller than the old version. Would you agree? That's for you. You're welcome. Now let me ask you. Let me test your Polaroid IQ. That you all seen that? That's the contemporary Polaroid. How many of you guys remember this Polaroid? Yes, because you couldn't touch it, right? Raise your hand if you remember that one. Raise your hand. A lot of people. You guys remember this one? Raise your hand. 50s and up. These are older people. How many of you guys remember this one? Yeah, we used to put the solution on the... How many of you guys remember that? Raise your hand. Be praying for the dead, the walking dead. Because if you remember that one, man, you're about ready to go, okay? Sorry. But you know it's true. That's what a Polaroid does for you. If you have an image or you have a good report that can really describe accurately what the thing looked like, the next person he gives it to, maybe it's an investigator back in 1980, he'll also write a report about the evidence. You can compare his report to the first report. They're going to bring it into the crime lab. They'll take the first, back in those days it was 35 millimeter film, now it's digital. They'll write reports, very big forensic reports. They'll give it to the next guy, me, I'll sign it in or sign it out of evidence and bring it to the courtroom. Now I've got image after image after image, report after report after report. I can see if the evidence is changing over time. That is called the chain of custody. In every case you work, trust me, they're going to want to know, is the chain of custody intact? Is it reliable? But is there a New Testament chain of custody that I can use to test the Gospels? It turns out there is. Let's take a look at it. Here we are at the crime scene. Here's the courtroom down the about 300 years later. The question is, who's the first officer at the crime scene? Who's the first guy who at the scene takes the first Polaroid? Let's say it's John. He takes a Polaroid of Jesus called the Gospel of John. But how do I know what's in his Polaroid? Could be anything. Well, who are the next officers that he gives the Polaroid to? He's going to give this account to somebody, and it turns out he did in history. He gave it to 3 of his students, Ignatius, Polycarp, and Papias. These are the students of John, who, lucky for us, became leaders in the church. And they then wrote to their local congregations and told us what John taught them. So now we have a test. We can see what is John saying about Jesus because we have the writings of the church fathers. It turns out we have 7 letters from Ignatius written to the local churches. By the way, I'll also send you this chain of custody as a Bible insert. So here we have the letters of Ignatius. We can read and we can see, and he's actually quoting or alluding to several Gospels, several letters of Paul. We've lost the work of Papias. We don't know what he wrote about this. All we have is what Eusebius said he wrote. And then we have the letters of Polycarp. We have one surviving letter to the church in Philippi, where we can see what he's quoting. He's quoting from Gospels. He's quoting from Paul's letters. And then we go to the next officer in the chain of custody, because there's another officer. These 3 guys, 2 of them at least, had a student named Irenaeus. Irenaeus then becomes another church leader in the early church. He actually ends up writing a whole volume full of stuff in which he's defending the Orthodox Christian view. And we have his writings, which are very, very abundant. And it turns out Irenaeus even has a list of the 24 books he is actually using with his student. So if you think that the Gospels, that the New Testament canon of Scripture was formed in some church council like Nicaea, that's a lie. The New Testament canon was developed very early, quoted very often, and already assembled by the church fathers hundreds of years before the councils. Don't let anyone tell you that the books in your Bible were invented by the Catholic Church. They were used early by the eyewitnesses' students and then their students. So Irenaeus here talks a lot about this. He has a student named Hippolytus. Hippolytus, unfortunately, got in some trouble with the papacy and ends up in custody, actually with the Roman government, and ends up in custody. He also says a lot of the same things that Irenaeus does. So if you're wondering what is being said about any of these books, you can actually go to the people in the chain of custody. Unfortunately, because he gets in custody, I cannot find a student of Hippolytus. So this chain of custody stops right here. But the good thing is, we've got other chains of custody, like this chain of custody from Paul. He mentions Linus and Clement in his letters. These 2 guys became bishops in Rome. Clement wrote a beautiful letter called First Clement. It's really a nice letter, very orthodox, but it's not in Scripture because it's not from an eyewitness. Clement was a student of Paul. But if you wonder what Paul's teaching, read First Clement. and all the way through the Roman leadership to Tatian, here from Peter through Mark, who hand-selected the first 5 bishops of the North African church, who started a school in Alexandria led by Pontineus, all the way through Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Pamphilus, and Eusebius. We get all the way to the council. I've got picture after picture after picture, report after report after report of Jesus. I can see if the story is changing over time. And they're in 3 different regions of the empire. I've got it here in Rome, here in Asia Minor, Ephesus, here in North Africa. And in the 3 separate regions of the empire, I can see what's being said about Jesus, and is it changing over time? And if you lost the entire New Testament and all you had was the writing of the first officers in the chain of custody, here's what you'd know about Jesus. You'd be stuck with the Jesus that Bart Ehrman doesn't like, the one who was born of a virgin, the one who preached sermons, who claimed to be God, who died on a cross, who rose from the dead, who ascended into heaven, who is seated at the right hand of the Father, and who through, if by faith alone you are saved. That is the earliest version of Jesus, described early, repeated often, and it never changes. So this idea that it's an honest and accurate report over time was pretty compelling for me. Let's go to this last issue right here. Biased. How do we know whether or not this is a biased account? How do we know if these folks, for example, had some, if you work domestic violence cases, they're very hard to work. Because when you get there, each person wants the other person to go to jail. I hate to say it, but it's true. And sometimes you get there, and I can't even find a mark on the girl, and the guy looks like he's been hit with a chair. And he'll say, I didn't start this. I bent over, she beat me over the head with this bottle. I was just defending myself. Who do I believe? Who do you think goes to jail when both people say the other person started it, both can show you some kind of injury, they both go to jail? Who can I trust? I don't even know who to trust. Bias changes everything. It turns out bias is all based on motive. Bias is rooted in motive. Why would I do this? Why would I say something that's not true? It turns out there are only 3 motives behind any murder. I'm going to teach them to you tonight. Only 3 reasons why anyone commits a murder. Only 3 reasons why anyone tells a lie. Commits any sin you've ever committed, you've only committed it for one of these 3 reasons. You don't walk into a crime scene and go, oh my gosh, there's 1,000 reasons why he could have killed her. No, there aren't. There are 3. You find me somebody in one of those 3 categories, we're done. What do you think they are? Any ideas? What's the first one? Money, yeah. Financial greed is huge. What's the second one? Love, sex, lust, relational or sexual lust. What's the third one? It's harder. Revenge. Why would you want revenge? Go deeper. Why are you angry? Go deeper. What? Oh, you know the book for you cheating. Yes, pursuit of power. That's the third one. Sometimes it's very nuanced. Nobody disrespects me in my neighborhood. Pop. What is that? That's an authority issue. It's a power issue. So everything is nuanced in these 3 categories. But there are no other categories. Trust me. People always try to offer a 4th category. There isn't a 4th category. This is it. But it makes it easy for us, because if we're saying that the disciples lied because they were biased or had a motive, well, we know they can only be in one of these 3 areas. So what do you think the disciples had in these 3 areas? If you want to test the disciples, there are not 1,000 reasons why they might lie. There are only 3. Did they get a lot of money out of this? Did they get a lot of girlfriends out of this? They have a power. Power is something you got to consider, really, don't you think? I mean, after all, they became kind of like, important in their own religious communities. That could drive people to do something. Right? You're a leader and you get to go around and tour the cities and everyone waits for you to come and preach. Okay, I want you to think about that for a second. I think that's possible, but is it reasonable? Paul is already a religious leader in his Jewish community where he's been assigned to kill the Christians. So Paul says to himself, I think I'm going to go ahead and jump out of this group that's pretty well funded and actually a pretty cool group. And I'm going to join these renegades so someday I might possibly be back in the same position I'm in today. Really? I mean, it's possible. Don't think it's reasonable. Remember, there's a difference between fame and infamy. If you're a leader in the church in the 1st century, you're like this deer in this Far Side cartoon. Bummer of a birthmark, Hal. Oh, dang. Every church leader in the 1st century had that bullseye on his forehead. And we kind of know from reading the traditions of the early church how these guys lied. Now, I don't want to say how they died. I don't want to say that I trust all of these descriptions of the martyrdoms of the apostles, because some of these are better attested than others. But I do know this: there is not a single ancient record that any of these men ever recanted their story, ever. There are 3 eyewitnesses to the golden plates in Mormonism. I happen to know a lot about this, unfortunately. My families are all Mormon on one side. Oliver Cowdery, David Whitmer, Martin Harris. All 3 said they saw the eyewitness. They were eyewitnesses to the golden plates, yet all 3 of those men were either chased out of the church or voluntarily left the church after saying they saw the golden plates, from which the Book of Mormon was translated. As a matter of fact, Martin Harris was a member of several Christian denominations after Mormonism. If you say you saw something, but then you're willing to recant, there's a problem. Also, all of you in this room would probably say you believe in Christianity enough that you'd be willing to die for it. Am I right? How much evidential value do you think your deaths for this truth claim would have? 0. Lots of people die for what they don't know is a lie. But if you were the eyewitnesses who actually knew if this was true, and you were willing to die rather than ever change your testimony about it, how much evidential value would that have? Zing, very different. Your willingness to die for Christianity is different than theirs, because they knew if it was a lie. Let's just end this section with this. I can't trust the Gospels, because let's face it, the Gospels, geez, these are written by Christians. I mean, seriously. Again, give me some history of Jesus that's not written by a Christian, and maybe I'll consider it. But if it's written by a Christian, it can't be accurate history. That's just a stupid claim. I want to just debunk it for you. By the way, if you're working robbery homicide, and you're not assigned a homicide that day, what are you working? You're assigned a robbery homicide. No homicide. So you're working robbery, like a bank robbery, this bank robbery. Here's a guy who walked in, did a very simple demand note robbery. That's where you walk in, you have a gun in one pocket and a demand note in the other. Put the demand note on the table, put the gun on the table. She reads the demand note, she sees the gun, she starts giving you money. You don't even need to open your mouth. It's a great robbery. He walked in, and the minute he walked in, unfortunately, he picked the wrong bank. Because when he walked in, this woman sitting behind the assistant manager's counter looked over there and saw him and recognized him immediately because they had gone to high school together. But they had a lot of customers in the bank, so she figured, okay, I'll just talk to him when he's done doing his transaction, because I got a customer. When he's done, we'll talk. I want to say hello. But now she looks up and she sees her coworker's got the look on her face like, hey, push the button, push the button, push the button. This guy's robbing me. And this gal can't believe it. I mean, she's shocked. I know she's shocked because it says so right here. Actually, she's shocked for a better reason than that. She's shocked because she knew this guy in high school. And she knew him to be a stellar student, great athlete, somebody who was involved in like the student body leadership. If she had to write a list of all the people who would ever commit a robbery in her lifetime, this guy would be on the bottom of her list. This is not a bank robber, in her opinion. This is somebody she would never think of as a bank robber. Yet here he is doing a bank robbery. I've called him Robert Smith. It's not his real name. Do you think I should go interview her? After all, she saw the whole thing. Do you think she'd be a good witness in this account? I could go interview her, but I don't think she'd be a very good witness. Do you think, Kathy, the manager, she actually thinks Robert Smith's a bank robber. Do you think I can trust anyone? You can kind of say she's like a Robert Smithian. Can you ask a Robert Smithian and get the truth about Robert Smith? No, I don't think so. Okay, do you see how stupid that is? She's not biased. She didn't start off thinking that Robert Smith was a bank robber, okay? She ended up there on the basis of observation. She's convinced now because she saw it with her own eyes. She didn't start, don't discredit her just because she happened to know Robert Pryor or she happened to have spent time with Robert Pryor. As a matter of fact, let's think about this for a second. How similar is this to, say, one of the apostles writing a gospel? I think she's qualified. She'd be a great witness in trial. I think you think so too. But if I compare her to someone like John or Matthew, if I compare her to Matthew, Matthew is a tax collector. He's not even part of the original disciples of John the Baptist. He's not one of the friends of the apostles. He's a tax collector. And he gets a tap on his shoulder from Jesus. Come on with me for a few years. I want to show you some stuff. After 3 years of watching that nonsense, he is convinced. He's convinced that Jesus is God. Not because he had a bias that started off beforehand, because he ended up with a conviction on the basis of observation. If you can trust Kathy, you can trust Matthew. Now, we started with this guy, and we asked this question. Can you trust anything he says? No, you really can't trust anything he says. We know why you can't trust him. But we're going to look at the reliability of the Gospels. We'll turn a corner here. Can we trust these eyewitness accounts? Well, you build reliability on those 4 legs I told you about. So we first say to ourselves, well, are they written early enough? And I've given you some good reasons to believe they're written early enough. And if those reasons are valid, this is a good inference. They're present, at least. Then you can ask yourself, well, can they be corroborated in some way? And we didn't talk about anything in this category. And there's a lot of evidence we could have covered in this category. We didn't cover any of it. It's in the book, but I'm going to send it to you. I'll send you the whole video, okay? I think this is a reasonable inference given the corroborative evidence. We talked about also whether they're accurate over time. Well, we already described that's a chain of custody issue. I think this is a reasonable inference also. And finally, we got to ask ourselves, do these folks actually have bias that would exclude them as reliable witnesses? What's in it for them? What are they getting out of this? I think this is a reasonable inference also. This is how we make a circumstantial case for reliability of any eyewitness. And to the extent that you could ever verify any eyewitness from the past, especially 2,000 years ago, there's nothing that's more corroborated, that's more reliable than the gospel accounts, because you can't do this with any other ancient document. I didn't hear that, but is that a good comment or a bad comment? I hope it's a good one. Good. So in the end, this is why I believe we can trust Jesus in a way we couldn't trust the other guy. Make sense? I've given you now an account and a way to assess the Gospels in a very forensic way. But this doesn't really resolve the problem I had, because when I got to this point, I said, okay, reliable accounts, but I reject the resurrection. I can believe these are reliable up to the point where they describe a miracle. Then I'm out. When you get a miracle in an ancient text, it's no longer history, it's now mythology. It changes the category. So I would have rejected the miraculous elements of the Gospels. And that's the next hurdle I had to jump, and we'll do that after the break. We'll talk about the resurrection. Chris.
Let's give him a big hand, you guys. Fantastic. Are you guys enjoying this so far tonight? Yeah? Awesome. We have one more session tonight that we're going to do, but first we are going to have some dinner. Let me give you a little bit of instructions on this. And actually, before I do that, I did forget something. I mentioned about the seminar that's going to be happening this coming weekend over. In order to find it, you need to go to this particular website, and I don't have it on the screen, but I do want to, if you're interested, write this down really quick. I'm going to spell it for you because it's hard to spell. Okay, you ready? All right, here we go. It's symposiachristi.com. That's symposiachristi.com. symposiachristi.com. So if you're interested in registering for that or getting more information, that's where you're going to find that for next weekend's conference.